Okay, so the key principles that underpin a rights-based approach to inclusion, you'll see there it's about the universal right, the inalienable right to education. Every learner has the right to be developed to their full human potential. And you'll see all these principles that we are promoting in this module. It's not about the principles, it's about how we understand them and interpret them and ultimately implement them. All these principles need to be translated into our classroom practice. They underpin what we do. Okay, so if you think about interrelatedness, interdependence, non-discrimination, all these things direct us as we think about how do I make my teaching more effectively. And then you would be required to really think deeply and evaluate the implementation of these key principles of the right-based approach in your country, in your context, and to give us practical examples of what you would do to ensure that, the fundamental right to education is upheld, or that participation is fostered, or that everything you do is promoting equality among your diverse learners. Now, as I've been saying, they're very different approaches, and sometimes these approaches to inclusive education tend to be in conflict, okay? So as I've said before, there's the medical approach, it's a biological and deficit-focused approach. It looks at what the learner cannot do. So when it comes to disability, you're going to see all these things about the learner's deficits and framing the condition as a disorder. What we're needing to understand is, where does this come from? So it's emphasizing the differences and disabilities. It pathologizes it's a very pathological approach to, these are the individual sort of impairments that the learner has. And in the 15th century, we saw the introduction of custodial care and the establishment of special schools globally. We also saw that, individuals with disabilities were not just segregated, but they were institutionalized. And they would remain in those institutions, their whole lives. And institutionalization is completely opposite to what we're promoting, because if you institutionalize an individual, they are almost like a form of imprisonment and separated and segregated from the rest of the society, and certainly from their families and from their communities. And so this is the complete opposite of what we're promoting in our work now. And so the whole process would begin with a diagnosis, and you would say that this learner's disability is X, and X then led to entrenchment of the disability label. You couldn't see the learner as separate from that label. And quite frequently the label might have been inaccurate, but once there was a label of autism or intellectual disability or whatever the label was, that label would stick to that learner like glue, and the learner would be stuck with that label permanently, okay? And then the focus in this medical model has traditionally been on seeking treatment or a cure, and not support for the individual. As things have evolved historically, these views of disability have been extended and other lenses have been brought to really consider, you know, alternative ways of understanding disability. So one approach has been the social constructivist approach, which really was the forerunner to, you know, how things have evolved to inclusive education. And so now we're viewing disability as socially constructed, explains why there's exclusion and marginalization. And Vygotsky's concept of disability as socially constructed informs the theoretical perspectives of what it is to be normal. So we're not talking about normal learners and, you know, the ones that are disabled or abnormal, because that would be the natural sort of opposite. We're looking at the typical and the atypical. But over time, there's been a trend towards normalizing learners with disability, mainstreaming them or integrating them. And as you can see, these were the sort of forerunners that came before the concept of inclusion. So first, segregation, and then we saw more normalization, so regarding disability as normal or as natural human variation. And then mainstreaming, which is limited because the focus is on making that learner fit into the mainstream, okay? And then integration of making them part of the mainstream, but not a support. And that, with that gradual sort of transitioning to the concept of inclusive education, all of us in the field have become much more sort of attuned to thinking about now, what does the learner need? What does the individual need in terms of support so that he or she can develop to his or her full human potential? And so it's about maximizing the ordinary mainstream school and minimizing the segregated placement in special schools, what's referred to here as your separate facilities, okay? So you want to accommodate the majority of your learners within ordinary mainstream schools, and only a small minority who might need intense support or who pose what Salamanca says is the learner is placed in the segregated setting only if they pose a danger to themselves or to other learners. And that's a tricky thing because so much subjectivity then comes into play. Okay, read about that in your study guides and the e-results. So we focus on the concept of Africanization. Now, this is very important in our South African and African contexts, where, as I said previously, an African worldview has been marginalized. So we do need to redress this in our own history. And of course, we've had colonialism and the imposition of other people's worldviews and values on ourselves. And we need to redress this quite urgently. In our curriculum, so we talk about decolonializing the curriculum, we talk about African perspectives. It's really just saying that, you know, there's a diversity of worldviews that we need to take into consideration, that everybody needs to be accommodated, and that we're promoting, you know, different perspectives of how we see our role as teachers, how we see our relationship with colleagues as, you know, more of a collective, collaborative approach. It's about working together rather than in isolation. It's about cooperating with colleagues, collaborating rather than competing. And so you'll see here we are considering what the principles of an Afrocentric approach to inclusive education could potentially, you know, be, and we want you to think about this and to think about what this means in terms of your learner's identity, recognizing and appreciating and really respecting the very diverse learners in your classroom, their identity and our own as teachers. And then to think about Pan-Africanism, read about this in your study guide in the e-reserves. Look at African culture and heritage and how these can positively contribute towards enriching learning. And then the issues around African values. Again, it's about community, about community building. It's about not just thinking about ourselves as individuals, but thinking about others and learning with others and getting along with others. Because at the end of the day, we want a better world for ourselves and our children. And then we're not just learning, content. We're preparing for active involvement and a positive contribution to our communities and society. We want active citizens. And so we're talking about education and not just schooling. So learning for life. Okay. You'll see that the Afrocentric approaches to inclusive education are going to deal with, the African philosophy of Ubuntu, communality, interdependence, seeing ourselves as part of communities of teachers, communities with parents, and, our learners must also have the sense of being part of something bigger than themselves. And so we consider the different belief systems, the cultural heritage of our learners, the different values, again, respect for these differences that our learners bring into the learning and teaching situation. And so, I, for one, really urge my students to think of diversity as a strength and not a challenge. Diversity must enrich us, must deepen our understanding. Our personal sort of perspectives and bias need to be confronted. We really have to reflect on, how do I feel about this? What do I think when I see a learner like that? We've got to challenge ourselves. We've got to have a much greater awareness of our own bias. And I feel very often as teachers, we are unconscious of how our own attitudes shape our interactions with our learners and their families. And this could be a barrier to our learners. And so, historically, we just need to admit and acknowledge that African perspectives have been marginalized. We've regarded this very negatively as archaic or backward or primitive or outdated or barbaric. And this is wrong, because there's something valuable here that can enrich the learning and teaching situation for all of us. Okay, the next thing we focus on in this module are the learning theories. And there's 3 learning theories that I want you to study very thoroughly. It's behaviorism, cognitivism, and social cognitivism. And I'm not going to run you through these. The content is in your study guide, and I really, really encourage you to read from the additional resources on the e-reserves. The main thing that I'm drawing your attention to is that what teachers do in practice should be informed by a theoretical perspective. So these theories can shape or reshape or change or influence positively our practices as teachers. And there's many, many other theories. If you're going to progress to the Masters in Inclusive Education, you'll do very in-depth theoretical sort of work. And there's a whole body of theories that we will introduce you to that are applicable to better understanding inclusive education. But there's those few that I want you to do in this module. Okay. Now, the practical strategy for implementing inclusive education is known as curriculum differentiation. It's also called curriculum modification or accommodations or adaptations. We're calling it differentiation in this module, and you'll really need to think about what this is. How do I implement it in my classroom? Why is this important? When do I implement it and for whom? Now, in this module, we are dealing with learners with disabilities. So definitely curriculum differentiation is applicable to all our learners with disabilities. And it's about accommodating the individual learner's strengths, needs, and abilities. And how do we do it? We base it on the official curriculum, and we make the changes that the individual learner requires, and it's informed by the learner's learning profile. And you will do it within your individual education planning process, okay? Why is this important? Ultimately, we're ensuring that every learner has those three requirements of access, participation, and achievement. And we do it when? We do it on an ongoing basis. But definitely the individual education plan is done early in the academic year, and it is monitored closely, and all reporting is against the progress of the learner in relation to the individual education plan. So you're going to be tracking it on a quarterly basis at the very minimum. Now, in order to be inclusive, teachers must differentiate or accommodate the learning content, and we get the content in caps, the curriculum and assessment policy statements. We also adapt the learning environment. Some learners need low sensory environment, so we don't want to see a whole lot of bright lights and bright colors. If it comes to learners in, for example, a wheelchair, you have to think about how mobility and access is facilitated in the learning environment. When it comes to learners with visual impairment, you've got to think about where they are placed in the environment. They need to be away from open doors and windows. You've got to put them very close to the whiteboard, chalkboard, smartboard, whatever you have in your classroom, but they are seated close to the teacher. Now with COVID and wearing masks, you've got to think about, if you have a learner with a hearing impairment, how are you accommodating that learner who might be relying on lip reading, okay? They're going to have more visual support. For your learner with a visual impairment, they're going to need more auditory support. So it's very much about recognizing the learner as an individual, planning for the learner as an individual, and making the curriculum accommodations for the learner as an individual. So you're also going to think about what kind of learning resource support material do I need for learners with various disabilities. So what does my blind learner need? What does a learner with a hearing loss need? Learners with autism, with attention deficit disorder, your cerebral palsy, learners with quadriplegia, hemiplegia, paraplegia, what do they need? So you're thinking the learner will direct you. You need to understand the specific challenges that the learner encounters, and then think deeply about how do I accommodate the learner's needs based on these challenges that he or she has. And so you've got to think about how you pace your activities. Some learners are going to need more time or less time often more time. You're going to think about the duration of your activities. And then you cannot adapt everything and leave your assessment standardized. So there's no one test or one standardized exam paper. You are accommodating your learners through the adapted assessment as well. So assessment must also be tailor-made to the individual learner's needs. Every learner must experience success. If the learner does not achieve, then we have not sufficiently adapted our assessment, not the outcomes. The outcomes remain the same as it is presented in the curriculum and assessment policy statements. We do not change the outcomes of the curriculum, but we change practically everything else, okay? So I want you to really understand that curriculum differentiation is the main strategy to implement inclusive education. If you are not adapting or differentiating the curriculum, you cannot expect to be successful at inclusion. It's as simple as that.